Okay, welcome to the exam survival panel. Thank you everyone for coming. Please turn on your cameras if you can to make all the panelists feel welcome. Today we are joined by 4 experienced civil engineering tutors who have taught a broad range of units and have done very well in many of these units. These tutors are Jacob, Lynn, and Julian, who have done a great job, and you can see them in Spotlight hopefully. Could you guys please introduce yourselves, starting off with Julian, then Lynn and Jacob?
Okay. Hey everyone, I'm Julian. I'm tutor and a student. I'm currently studying civil engineering and architecture. I'm in my 5th year. And in the past, I've tutored structural mechanics, concrete, and I'm currently tutoring project appraisal this semester. Some of you may have seen me if you're in my tutorials.
Hi, I'm Lynn. I'm also studying civil engineering and I also study music studies, so a double degree. I tutor structural mechanics and steel structures.
I'm Jacob, and I'm at the end of my 5th year of civil engineering and project management degree. I've tutored 7 different subjects, but this semester it was steels, soils, and fluids. And fun fact about me, I'm writing a book. I've been writing it since the start of the year, and that's been a little bit of fun. About 30-something thousand words in, which is a lot of words.
Wow, yeah, that's quite cool. Yeah, so have any of you been doing anything interesting? Just any fun hobbies during lockdown?
I mean, that was one of my interesting ones. The other thing is, ever since the coding part of my thesis finished, I needed like another coding outlet. So I decided to learn Unity, which is like the video game engine, which involves coding in C# and stuff. So that was fun.
Okay, so I think we might start with the questions. So over the last few semesters, we've had online exams. What are some advice you'd share for specific to online exams? Maybe starting off with Lynn.
Yeah, so my advice for online exams, a lot of them are open book, just because they're online, so it's a bit harder to monitor them. But I think treat them as if they wouldn't be open book, just because it's often really difficult to go through all your notes and all your textbooks to find that information. I always have quite a detailed set of notes for all of my exams, so I would definitely recommend doing that and referring to that because it's a bit smaller all in one place rather than relying on your textbooks or your lecture notes.
Yeah, definitely. Julian, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, it's similar to Lynn, though I'm not a fan of. In a paper exam, you may have had to memorize some of the content or just be familiar with the content. And it's the same here, but I personally am not a fan of rote learning. So yeah, it's good to have your own lecture notes to refer to. If not, though, you should be familiar with when all the content occurs, like which lecture it's in. So if you do really need to look at it, then you can find it easily just because you already know where it is. Even if you don't know the content itself, you know how to find it very quickly. Yeah. And also, yeah, make Excel spreadsheets.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And if your Excel spreadsheets aren't allowed, which they may not be, depending on your course, but they might be for a completely open book exam. Yeah, I'd go with Lynn as well and recommend like that formula sheet, detailed formula sheet or detailed notes. You can be broader than formulas. This is mine for skills. This is got like struct stuff and then tension and compression and more on the next page. But I do have a note at the end for how to deal with Tim's discussion questions, where you consider different aspects, like you consider geometry and you consider what has changed and how that changes, like IX, whatever. There's some sort of line of reasoning that you can think of quite clearly when you're not in an exam, but in an exam you can be a little bit flustered. And so writing that down beforehand can help with that. Also, like bookmarking stuff, like where your UBs and your EAs or whatever are if you're doing steels. And I would highlight the particular sections that Tim tells you about if you know them in advance. Just gives you like, the most possible time in an exam to answer your questions, basically.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I've never thought about writing like discussion type points. So that's something to think about. So my next question is, how much time do you dedicate to studying for each exam? Starting off with Julian.
Depends on how much time I have. So because I do architecture, some semesters I've just had that submission very close to the exams, and then then I don't really choose how much time I could study. I just study whatever time I have. But in general, if you're familiar with the tutorial content already, you probably need between a week or a few days before the exam to start revising and doing practice papers.
Yeah, so like expanding on that, for people who want to get like a HD or do really well in that subject, like how much time do you think you spend like extra versus like the normal amount?
Probably a little bit difficult to say. I was talking to Benji earlier today, and he was talking about like passing. And he was suggesting that if you do attend all lectures and all tutorials, you probably will pass. That's not a lot of people. A lot of people will sort of try and watch a recording later, or maybe even skip it all together. But if you are just looking to pass, there are some like minimum things you can do. As for the sort of studying hours, yeah, I would find that like, yeah, it would definitely depend on the subject. And maybe that's more the subjects tell you how to distribute your time. So I remember the semester I was doing soils and fluids and this other project management subject that had an exam. We spent 3 days, like full days on soils. I did it with some friends, and we would like study for that. I don't know if I'll mention how now, which is basically going through past papers for soils. It's 2 days going through past papers for fluids. And we were going to spend 1 day on the project management subject, but we realized there was nothing really to study for. It was just how well did you remember the lecture slides? So we canned that day. And we all did our own sort of individual study in that. But I think, yeah, it definitely depends on the subject and which one you think like you understand the least and what needs the most understanding.
Yeah. So Lynn, do you have anything to add?
Pretty much the same as what the other two have said. It does like depend on the subject and the exam. I think if you've followed along with the content throughout semester already, then there's less time that you need to put toward that subject because you're kind of just revising. But if you are kind of learning a lot for the first time, then obviously you need to put more time into it. And then also some exams are easier than others. So yeah, it just depends.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Like, if you're revising and you realize that you already are familiar with the content, and you probably don't need to be spending more time, just make sure you don't forget it. Past paper is a good way to tell if you actually know, especially if they have solutions.
Yeah.
To tell. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. You don't want to like overstudy if you reach that point. So another question is, quite a few students have been behind in some subjects, and there may be cramming. Do you have any recommendations for them? Any sort of tips if you find yourself in a similar situation?
It's probably hard because I don't know how much cramming I've done. There's one subject that comes to mind in particular, but the thing that I found surprisingly helpful is studying with friends. That I've found to be very helpful when none of you really understand what's going on. When all of you understand it, it becomes quite a distraction. You just start talking, you get a little bit distracted, and at least in my case, you don't study as hard. But if none of you really know what's happening, which might be the case if you're all cramming or like something like that, then it actually is quite helpful because you're able to catch each other up, or you're able to sort of help each other out. So I found that kind of thing that's helpful in those sorts of circumstances.
Yeah. So Julian, do you have anything to add?
The best thing would be if you didn't need to cram, but obviously at this point, it's a bit late. It's yeah, for me, even if you are cramming, yeah, you need to figure out what's the best use of your time if you don't have that much time left. And usually it would probably be doing past papers if they're available. There's no point going through weeks of lectures or hours and hours of lecture recordings if you only have a couple of days. you need, yeah, I reckon practice is more important.
Yeah, yeah, pretty important to focus on practice, I guess. So Lynn, do you have anything to add as well?
Same thing, really, like better to not cram. I haven't really had that much experience cramming, but I would think if you are, then just focus on the things that are most important, kind of maybe the topics that you're most unsure about. Yeah.
Yeah, on that, yeah, because I think the recording thing is a good point. Lecture recordings at that stage may not be the most helpful. I mean, it will depend on the subject. Like if it steals, you're not going to properly understand it if you haven't watched Tim's videos or whatever. But I think in general, there are other resources like the tutorials or your exams will be a little bit better. And you can do like one final exam first as like a benchmark to see like, what do I know, what don't I know? And then you can do a little bit of study on those topics. And then you can do sort of another one to test, like, what did I learn? And that's like the two uses of an exam.
Yeah, like also just a follow-up question. So like we've been talking about lecture slides and lecture recordings versus doing practice questions. Do you think if someone was learning the like cramming the content, would they like look towards the textbook or some other resource?
Yeah, I think there can be advantages of those things, and the advantages are the pace mainly. That the lecture recordings are limited even at 2 times speed. They can only go as fast as half the total recording time. Whereas if you are looking at a textbook or course notes or something for that subject, or the slides as opposed to the recordings, you can at least jump to the parts that are most relevant in that quicker time frame. Probably won't give you the most holistic understanding of a subject, and that will depend on the subject, whether they're testing a holistic understanding or whether the subject's just testing like memorization or certain things. And definitely some engineering subjects test understanding more than others. But yeah, that's the suggestion there.
Yeah, and also since we have online exams now, and most of them are open book, then you actually have access to the lecture slides. So if you, or like during the exam, so if you don't need to cram all the lecture slides at 2 times speed before. When if you see the question pop up and you don't expect it, you can just open your downloaded lecture video and find the timestamp. On that note, I think it's also good for cramming that you want to try and predict which topics you think will be more important or will be worth more as well when you're studying, and then focus on those when you're cramming, if you have to cram.
Yeah, I think that's one of the later questions where we talk about what topics are some of the key topics in the questions. Yeah, I thought it was interesting how you said the timestamp, looking at the timestamp on the lecture slide, like the lecture recordings. How does that work?
If you're familiar with the slides, then you can just kind of like look at the preview, depending on what video or what video player you're using, and just see which slide that is, and then just listen to what the lecturer has to say at that point. You don't want to waste too much time.
Yeah. So Lynn, do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry, what was the question again?
So when looking at resources like textbooks and lecture slides versus lecture recordings.
Yeah, I think if you can do tutorial questions, that's really helpful because you can read about it and you can think that you understand it, but then you get to the questions and you're like, I don't know what this means. So definitely having practice doing the actual questions is very helpful.
Yeah, of course. So final exams are stressful times, obviously, at this time. A lot of people are struggling with their mental health. What have you done to alleviate some of your stress and take care of your mental health?
I think being kind to yourself is very important, and just looking at the ways that you talk to yourself in your head. Don't focus too much on exams. Like they are important, but it is just one small part of your life. Like there are other important things, so don't put too much pressure on it. But then also, in moderation. Like you still need to do your exams.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, but you do want to set realistic goals. Like your expectation should not be before my final exams, I'll be studying, every hour of the day. Like you don't want that. That's not good for you, and that's not going to work out too well. For me, the advantage of studying groups is there was a subject I knew I couldn't really study it by myself. I needed to study with friends. Then the days that I wasn't like with my friends, I knew I could like not think about that subject. And it was quite nice to sort of separate it like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Julian, do you have anything to add to that?
Not much. Just make sure you take breaks. Especially, it's easy when you do past papers, you just take a break after each one. But if you're just revising content, just set yourself maybe 1 or 2 hours, and then take like a 5 or 10 minute break.
Would you, like, following up on that, would you like recommend Pomodoro technique or something similar to that?
I haven't used any of those techniques, so I can't really recommend any of them.
I'm a big fan of the Pomodoro technique, which is, if you don't know, it's 25 minutes on like working and then 5 minutes off. And I find that really useful for like structuring your study. If you're feeling unmotivated, then yeah, it's a great way to work.
So that kind of links up to a question we had a bit later. So some people are obviously feeling burnt out. So drawing on your own experiences, how have you dealt with burnout and how do you bring back motivation?
Yeah, there can be a little bit of at the end of a uni semester, especially with all the assignments and like everything that you're sort of aiming for. You feel quite tired or like, what's the point? I just get this in and let's not worry about it. I think taking a break between those things can be helpful, like between when your final assignment is due, whether it's tonight or tomorrow night or something like that, and actually studying for the final exams. I think that can help be a bit of a refresher. Not always possible, like Julian was saying, you could end up with an assignment that's due after the exam period or whatever, or like an architecture project that's due around that time. And I think that can make it a little worse. But in which case, it's probably better to look forward to the break that comes after and like have something planned for after that, if you know that's if you can't really take a break in the in-between.
Yeah, of course. And if you're trying to look forward to anything, maybe go to the EOS party and a STEM party, but enough of that. So Julian, do you have anything to add?
No, not really. Jacob more or less covered it.
Lynn?
Sorry, I'll go second next time.
Yeah, again, Pomodoro method really works for me for that, for feeling burnt out, feeling unmotivated. Just because you don't have to think about when you're working or when you're not, or if you're doing enough or not, because you just work when it's the 25 minutes and then not working on the 5 minutes. Yeah, and then just taking the pressure off the exams, realizing that it's not everything. Yeah.
So the next question is about when you're in the middle of like exam period or maybe towards the end of STUBAC and you have a lot of questions and like maybe in a study group you can't quite figure out the answers to these questions. Where would you direct those last minute questions and seek help for those subjects?
Yeah, so usually the lecturers have some sort of consultation. I know that's true for like soils or fluids or seals, which is the I'm tutoring. But there's usually some sort of consultation in SUVAC or before the exam, the day before or something. Or there's like an ed discussion forum. I found those to be quite helpful. And they're also helpful to set deadlines for your study. Like I want to do all my study up until like the day where I have all the like question answer session with David Airy or whatever. That way, once you're finished, you can ask him like all these questions. He can give you the explanation that you would never have thought of by yourself. And you can sort of move on from there. Whereas it's true, if you leave your study till after that point, you can try sending an email to a lecturer or like to a tutor or whatever. It's just harder to guarantee like a response if it's too late. Is really the main concern there. But yeah, normally there is some sort of consultation to help out.
Lynn, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's a really good idea, Jacob, kind of setting that deadline of the last consultation session. I think I often found like I had all these last minute questions, but then the consultation session already passed. So that's a good idea. Otherwise, yeah, asking your friends, asking other people in the class usually helps a lot. Like even if you can just talk it through together, usually you can come to some kind of solution, or yeah, it gives more clarity.
Yeah. So Julian, do you have any other resources that could work?
I think most courses now have ed forums, and if you post a question nicely on there, that's usually, well, usually the staff are, from what I found, they would, well, depends on the lecturer, but usually people like Tim will respond to almost every question there. And there's also, more often than not, there's probably some other student who is very good at answering those questions too. They'll probably just be hanging around the ed forums, helping people out, if you're lucky.
Yeah, that used to be my study, was going on to ed and answering other people's questions. No, that is actually a good point. And I will mention something. If you do want your ed question answered, the best type of thing to ask is, you ask a question, but you give some reasoning about what you've thought about so far. Like, we were thinking this, but this would be the problem with that, or we're trying this approach, but we're coming to no conclusion. Like, and then the sort of real phrasing comes with like any questions or any suggestions for what I should do, like instead. Just asking, what does this mean or why that is not a great sort of question, or is not seen as a great question, and is not as likely to get a response. So it's helpful to show a bit of your working out, show what you've done. And if like the staff see that you've put in the effort, then they're more likely to put in that effort to help out.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's something I'll add to my ed questions next time. So have you ever had like back-to-back exams? And if so, do you have advice for students who are in those situations, like how to spread out their studying?
Yeah, I can't quite remember. I must have had them at some point, like definitely in first year when you're doing 5 subjects and each one has an exam or whatever. So it must have occurred at some point. But I think the important thing is to think of them as, like they are back to back, but don't study for them. Like, so the way you might study for exam, I do all my study for my first exam, and the first exam's over, and I do all my study for the next exam. It's obviously not going to work in that case, right? So I think of it more as which exam needs more study, which one needs more focus, and then you're starting with that. And then eventually you will need a break from that subject, and that might be a good time to turn to the other one. Yeah, but it can be helpful to set yourself your own deadlines and a few other things when you're doing that.
I think with back-to-back exams, it really helps to have kind of a study schedule, and kind of like how much time you want to work on each subject every day, just to make sure you're working on all the subjects you need, and to time that with when your exams are as well.
Yeah,
I think with that, yeah, that's definitely good until up to the point where you're familiar with most of the content you need. And then, but once you start practicing, personally, I like to practice as if it was that exam day with the back-to-back exams. Like, for example, if I had one exam and then another straight after on the same day, I would do practice papers in that order, like alternate between them, but that's only after you're familiar with all the content. Before that, you should prioritize them one at a time.
Yeah. So just a follow-up on that. In between the back-to-back exams, would you recommend like taking it easier because like you're still recovering from the last exam, or do you think it would be better to just like get that like last minute extra studying in just in between?
I'd probably recommend taking it easy between exams. Exams are hard and it takes a lot out of you. And if you're going to do another one, you kind of want to regain a bit of that energy and that focus. So.
You definitely want to have lunch or, some whatever the break is. It's probably lunch, it's probably morning, afternoon, but it could be afternoon dinner, whatever. Take some sort of break between them. I don't think there's much point in the extra study unless there's something you need to memorize, and like you can only ever get into your short-term memory, and then okay, fine, you can look at some flashcards beforehand. But I think in general, you use the time to take a break. Like, I think if we're back on campus and it was a morning and an afternoon exam, it would be exam in the morning, I'd go get Subway, and then I'd like chat with some friends, and then we'd have exam in the afternoon. But obviously if you're at home, it's not quite the same, but you want to take that sort of break.
Yeah, and that applies before the first exam as well. You want to get sleep early the night before, if you can. Unless you absolutely have to. Unless you feel like you absolutely have to cram, then yeah, make sure you get some breaks between exams and before exams.
Yeah. Like you just have do you like allocate a bit of time before exams where you don't have any studying? Is that sort of thing that you do?
Yeah, like the day of the exam, I try to keep it to just skimming over really like compacted down top points of notes, but nothing more than that. Maybe like a few practice questions, like a warm-up, but yeah, ideally nothing.
Yeah.
And chatting with your friends about the exam may help, or it may psych each other out. Like that depends on you and your friends. And once you recognize that and recognize which of your friends is the type to like make you scared of the exam and which ones are the ones make you comfortable, try to stick to the ones that like help out. Because I don't know, you must have had that experience at school, if not at uni, of people like talking up for the exam or asking each other like ridiculous questions that definitely won't be asked. Yeah, try not to fall into that trap.
Yeah, I might have been guilty of asking ridiculous questions. It's just the panic. Like, what if they ask that really tricky question? So yeah, that leads up to my next question. How do you like identify trick questions or like, questions that might just they throw at you out of nowhere?
Yeah, for me, I'd say first step is to know your lecturer. Like, is your lecturer the type to throw trick questions at you? If you're doing solids with Changmeng or you're doing transport with Mosin, maybe even Reza as well, you are more likely to get some sort of trick like questions, especially the second part, if your exam contains true or false questions. True or false questions are almost always tricks. Like, but I really struggled when I had one subject where the true or false questions weren't tricks. It really played mind games on me. And it took me a few weeks of like weekly quizzes to adjust to the fact that my lecturer didn't like playing tricks. So for the most part, I think it's know your lecturer and be ready for that. And then like read the question real carefully. Like if it's a true false and it's like, all cases are like this, try to construct for your case a case where that's not true, right? Try to break the true false question. And if you can, then it's like that it's false. And it's not like it's thinking of the general or the usual attributes. It's usually phrased like that on purpose to make a question that's definitely true or definitely false, and you can't argue otherwise. So yeah, true false questions, always tricks.
Yeah, I don't think I've had to deal with that many trick questions. The true and false ones probably, but I think I just got those wrong. But yeah, with trick questions, just like reading the question quite carefully, looking at the wording, and yeah, really like analyzing it and making sure you're clear with what they're asking.
Yeah, when we were doing, well, even now when we don't have paper exams, like I would always bring a highlighter in to highlight the keywords in the question, but I always forget to use it. But it's recommended.
The purpose seems there. Yeah, for non-true false questions, it's not exactly a trick, but there is something that often people fall into. So I guess it's a bit like a trick, which is like units is a big problem. And reminding yourself of that before an exam can be very helpful. I remember before, I think our transport exam, we were talking to each other, like, oh, what are some tricks we might fall into? And one of them was like, oh, about units. And sure enough, there was a question where it gave some property in per hectare, and it gave some other property in per like kilometers squared or something. And those are like very different units, or 1,000 kilometers squared or something. There were things that looked sort of equivalent, but they weren't. They were actually different units. So recognizing some of those like common tricks beforehand can be helpful for spotting them in the exam.
Yeah, units is definitely a big one.
Are there any other like common tricks apart from units?
I did make a list a long time ago, but I'm not sure what happened to it. Yeah, like absolutes in it. And yeah, a little bit of what we're talking about with keywords and what they mean. Yeah, and things that you can assume to be zero. So you're doing fluid mechanics. There's a bunch of things you can assume to be zero and things that you can't always assume that they're zero. And like knowing when to make that distinction is important. I know that tripped up some people in the last fluids quiz is a few people took an assumption that something was 0, but like that wasn't valid. And it's difficult because we've made that assumption so many times in class for slightly different scenarios. So I think it's just being aware of what those differences are and when something can happen, when something can't happen. So yeah.
Yeah. So when you're running out of time during an exam, what would you recommend to minimize losing marks? Because like obviously you go in with maybe like a time plan, but sometimes it just falls apart during an exam. So maybe we'll start with Julian.
If you don't run out of time, tell us how. Tell us, what do you do, Julian, so you don't run out of time?
Well, if you don't want to run out of time, then like you just need more practice before the exam. But if you're running out of time already, that's too late. So
I mean,
yeah, definitely,
go.
like pick the questions which you feel like you can do first, and if you're like stuck on something, just put it on hold and go to some other question.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That time-consuming questions are just something like, even if you think you might know the answer, but it will just take you a bit of time, just skip it and like come back later. If you do make some sort of time plan, which can be helpful, depends on the exam whether that is helpful or not. The purpose of a plan, and this is true when I make time plans for like a tutorial that I have over here, where I have like a timestamp for everything. It doesn't actually matter that I stick to it exactly. What matters more is that if I've gone beyond the time allocated, I need to speed up. Whereas if I've gone, like if I'm below it, I can slow down and take my time. So I think the more important thing, if you are making a time plan, is just recognizing where you are and what you need to do. Like the plan itself doesn't have to be accurate, but it's helpful for that. And then the other thing is, it can be helpful to do like a first pass of a bunch of different things. Maybe it's less helpful in like a maths type of question because you just do half a question and leave it. But if you have some sort of written responses, it can be helpful to get something down and then move on to the next something and get your first something down for that, and then come back and give a more detailed response, than to try and give the most detailed response at first and then move on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, if you don't have much time left, then just doing what you can. Yeah, looking at the rest of the questions you have and seeing if there's something clearly that you can answer in the amount of time you have, then do that one. If there's something that's really difficult that you're not going to get, then let that go. Like it will be okay. And then also looking at the weighting of the questions and seeing the importance of them and what would be more worth you putting your time into.
Yeah, for the last set of fluids quizzes, I think Zhang Weng was recommending starting with the highest weighted question, which admittedly was worth almost half the quiz. So if you started with that and could finish that and then do a few other things, like you'd likely to pass. Whereas if you'd done the other way around and you left that to last, you were in a real like trouble if you can finish it. So that is helpful.
Yeah. So do you have any like routines or like exam rituals that you do beforehand that you think like positively impacts your performance in exams?
I kind of approach all my exams the same way. I don't really know if they're rituals, but just like making a study schedule of like all the exams I have, the time I want to put towards each exam, and then making notes, a set of notes for each exam. Even if you can't bring it into the exam, it's quite helpful to just go through all the content and be clear of it and write it down in a way that makes sense to you. Yeah, in the actual exam, I don't think I really have any rituals.
Well, you don't face to the west and say a particular chanter or something. Yeah, no, I'm trying to think about rituals. I think the Subway lunch was definitely a ritual for a while. I don't know if it helped performance, but it was just some sense of normalcy that I knew would happen, like between exams or after exams, before exams, depending what the exam was. Like I knew I'd get to uni, I'd get there early or late, and then I'd do the thing. If you're at home, that matters less, but it can still be helpful to have like your meal times or whatever, something scheduled around the exam outside of it, so you have a sense of time and all that.
Yeah, I like it. Oh, sorry, you continue.
Yeah, I was gonna say I watched a YouTube video before at some point. I can't remember when, it was a while ago, and it was about how to study effectively. And one of the tips was that if you have like a table lamp or something like that, only turn that on when you're studying it. So then whenever you turn it on, it kind of puts you in the zone. You can do the same with like music, like a particular type of music or so on when you're studying, and probably in an exam as well to get yourself focused. So you just kind of like train yourself to focus during that, like when that's happening.
Yeah, I've also heard that like changing your environment, or like even just going into a different room, helps to like retain information easier, which has actually worked for me. So yeah.
That's quite interesting. I think ritual might have been like the wrong word. I meant like more just like a routine. Like maybe you, every time you have an exam, you like wake up early and like, I don't know, do sit-ups or something. I don't know. But yeah, so I think we might move on to like more subject-specific questions. So in the 1000 level units being taught this semester are multivariable calculus, statistics, geology, materials, and engineering, construction, surveying. Out of these subjects, which one did you provide the most time to? And do you think these units should be equally balanced in terms of time?
It's been a long time since I think any of us have done any of these subjects, but probably I should have spent more time on calculus because I was like, sort of what I ended up doing the worst in, I think, in my own study regime. I think in first year, I was less familiar with the power of studying with friends. And it was a little bit of that. Like there is more time studying is one thing, but there's also like better studying is another thing. And being able to study in a better way, like that is more effective. So yeah, out of all of them, for me personally, it was maths. But for you, it should be whatever you're sort of struggling with like the most, or whatever you think you've not been doing well in so far. Because the reality is, if you've been matching sort of the lecturer's mindset for the entire semester, you probably match their mindset for the exam. If you've been completely different wavelength to them the entire semester, that probably not going to change in the exam, and so you need to do more of that work and study to sort of get yourself like the same place they are.
Yeah, I agree with Jacob. It depends on what you feel like you need most, but out of these subjects, I think from when I did it, out of these 5, engineering, construction, and surveying is the one different one where it's more content and knowledge based compared to other ones, which require more understanding. So especially with open book exams, that would not be as important for me, but it depends on the person.
Yeah. Lynn, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really.
Oh, good. So the next question is actually towards you, Lynn. I know you did quite well in geology. If you can remember, did you have like any specific exam strategies? It doesn't have to be specific to geology, but or anything?
Yeah, nothing really specific to geology. I think, yeah, just being familiar with all the content, going through all the slides just so you know like what has happened in the subject. And then, yeah, again, I really like having notes. So if you have a good set of notes, then that's really helpful as well.
And as Evan said, that the process of making those notes is more helpful than like the actual notes themselves. Like, yeah, like for geology at our time, it was in person, you were allowed 20 pages of notes. And I think the idea was basically it's open book, but 20 pages was just a limit. But the idea was if you made 20 pages of notes, you would be fine for the geology exam. You would barely look at them. You'd look at them maybe 2 or 3 times in the actual exam. But the process of making them was enough to sort of get you there. So yeah, I think that might be helpful for that particular subject, but also true for general subjects.
Yeah, of course. Julian, do you have anything to add?
No, it's the same, making notes for
Yeah.
geology.
Yeah, I think like you can do that little hack where you like Control F to just find the specific word or thing in the question online exams. So I think we might move on to like 2000 level questions. So currently the final exams with 2000 level questions are soil mechanics, fluid mechanics, and project appraisal. So maybe what subject do you think has the most difficult final exam out of those subjects?
I would say soil mechanics.
I've not done appraisal, but I would agree. I did a project.
Fluid and soils are quite close. I think appraisal is less difficult than those two.
Yeah. So like I know Jacob teaches soil mechanics. So like are there any specific key topics that you think are most important for the final exam, or anything like you should look out for?
Yeah, the sad answer to this is no. They are all important, and it comes in two parts. So there's the soil mechanics exam split into short answer questions, which are basically breadth testing. So they're testing knowledge from every single week, and there'll probably be one question on each week. And it will be a really basic question, something similar to what you did on a Tuesday lecture with David or in a tutorial. And you just sort of follow through with that. And that's about half the marks of the exam. And then the other half, it tests depth of knowledge in different topics. And it's less certain that all topics will be tested in that. And the only thing you do know for certain is that you're allowed to skip one question, like it's choose 2 of 3 or 3 of 4 or something. So you are allowed to get away with not deeply understanding one topic, right, in soil mechanics. That is something you can get away with. Probably don't make that topic be flow nets, because you will always get a flow net question, and it's usually easier than the other ones, so it's better to learn that one. But you are allowed to get away with not learning one topic. But in general, the thing I think that makes soils hard is you need to know everything in breadth, and you need to know most things in depth. And that's a big ask for like 12, 13 weeks of content.
Yeah. Do you guys have anything similar to add?
Yeah, there's always, I think when I did it, David would tell you that there will be a fluency question, and he actually recommends himself that that's the one of the 5 questions you pick to do. And I would agree with that. It's also kind of the fastest to do, since you just sketch something and the equations aren't too difficult.
Yeah, and I will add one thing to that, which is it's okay if you forget something or you make a little bit of a blunder in the exam, because that exam is not like Canvas marked. That exam is entirely like handwritten, and you upload working, and David marks the whole thing himself, or he gets markers to do it. And I do remember in the soils final, like out of the questions I chose, there was one I thought I could do, and then there was a part that I realized I couldn't do. But I knew the theory, and like I'd explained the theory in words for that question. And the next question required the answer to the previous one. And so I explained the theory in words for that, and I wrote down my equations and showed what I would do for that. And I think that got rewarded in the end, because my mark for soils was higher than I think had I completely got 0 on both of those questions. So it is fine to show understanding in an exam if you can't get the exact numbers. So focus on that part of soils.
Yeah, I think David marks that exam based on your process rather than your actual final answers.
Yeah.
I've heard that the soils exam is like quite a time crunch, and it's like very long. It's 3 hours. Do you have any advice for people doing really long exams? Like under all that like stress, how do you stay focused?
Yeah, it's tough. I think, and I'm sure Julian will suggest the same thing, that the practice really helps. So I recommend you do a soil. So my study for soils was basically 3 separate past papers. And we did basically a paper a day for 3 days. And that sounds like not a lot, but because the soils paper in an actual exam scenario is 3 hours, and that's not doing all the questions. If you are doing all the questions, you expect it to take about 4 hours. So you should spend like 4 hours on the one exam. And I know it's a little tough because you're talking about like taking breaks and things. But if you do it in those exam conditions, or at least your last practice is in those exam conditions, I think that's more helpful for when you go to do it. As long as your like last practice isn't, going through 2 a.m. before your exam is on, make sure you also get a good night's sleep before that.
Yeah. Anyone else have any tips for those long exams? Nope. Okay, all good.
You're allowed to go to the bathroom in between. I actually don't know how that works when it's online, but if you do need to, that can be better than holding it in for 2 hours or whatever you do.
Yeah. So I might pass on this question to Julian. What do you believe is like the most difficult element of project appraisal final exam, if there are any?
Project appraisal, that exam is probably one of the ones which you might see some trick questions. You just have to read those questions really carefully. And also, like, because they're mostly going to be, the questions will mostly be written as like a paragraph rather than some numbers. Even if they look like they're the same length, depending on the topic, it may take, some of them may take a lot longer than the others. So yeah, if you should be familiar enough with the topics to tell which one you should not do right now, because it'll take ages and come back later. But yeah, if you have Excel spreadsheets set up, yeah, you can just pretend you did the working out by hand. If you already have the answer, it'll make your life a lot easier.
Actually, on that trick question thing, I do have a story from when I was invigilating integrated engineering threshold exams. There was one of those exams had one trick question in it. And I actually sat the exam like after the students, and we marked them all present, whatever. The lecturer told me to go to the back and sit the exam. And I sat it, and I got caught out by a trick question because I was trying to answer it as quickly as possible. And then we checked, and we would time mark a student's paper if they submitted the paper early and then left. Every student who submitted the paper early got like, fell on that trick question, whereas every student who waited the whole time of it, like, or most of them at least, got that part right. So spending the time, looking at it, rereading it afterwards, once you've sort of done things, can actually really help in that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to look out for. So another question for Jacob. So with you teach fluids, do you have any tips for anyone doing a fluids final exam?
Yeah, so the tips of the exam is one thing. The other part is the tips of the studying for the exam. So I'll start with the studying because it comes first. So for the studying for it, we did over 2 days, but we just did all tutorial questions. Sort of, you would look at it, you'd look at the question, you'd solve it, you solve it in its entirety. I know we talked about, possibly skipping stuff you don't know. And if you don't have the time, then, that might be something you have to do. But if you do have the time, it's good to go through everything from start to scratch, because sometimes questions in fluids, you'll think you know how to solve that. And then you'll realize that actually it's missing one piece of information you normally have. And so when you actually go to attempt the question, you realize, oh, I don't know how to solve that. I need to think of a new way to do it. And the tip is that I think your exam questions will always be a little harder than your tutorial questions and all that. And the reason is they will mix topics. You'll always be able to solve your exam questions. Like, it's always something you can do. But they'll draw on, questions from week 1 and combine it with a question from week 5 and week 11. And it's up to you to sort of see how all of those things interact. It can be a little stressful in the final. But I think something that's helpful to know is that you can solve that with the knowledge that you had like throughout the course. If you're able to solve all those tutorial questions, you are able to solve like the exam question. It's just a matter of figuring out exactly how.
Yeah. So like Lynn or Julian, do you have any, how did you guys study for the fluids exam, or to add?
I don't really remember. I do remember that being quite a difficult one, though. That was a lot of content.
Unfortunately, you don't have much options for studying because we don't really release fast papers, and like it's just tutorial questions. There are also lecture questions and weekly assignments, I guess, but yeah, there's only so much you can do. But you can theoretically go through every question covered in the course, like in a short period of time before the exam.
So we might move on to 3000 level unit subjects. So this semester, I think engineering design and construction and steel structures 1 are the 3000 level student units being taught this semester. So for these units, how much time did you commit to studying for each subject during STUBAC and the time period and exam time period? And did you think this was enough time?
Is engineering design construction the Fahan one, Julian? Is that the one you're tutoring?
I'm taking that.
Yeah.
I'm no.
Oh, you're taking it. That's right. He wanted you to tutor it, and you were like, "I haven't taken that yet."
Yeah. Yeah, I think the same thing about that course as the first year construction course. It seems to be knowledge in content base. So there's a bit of Strand 7 now, which requires you to know how to use the software. But yeah, I don't think I'm planning on spending that much time on that unit. There's more important units like thesis, presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that subject, the construction one, has changed quite a bit since I did it 2 years ago. So I don't really know much about it this year. But I do remember steel structures. I spent not much time at all on studying for that exam. I think I only spent 3 days on it because I had fluids before it. But because I had been on top of all the content throughout the semester, it was fine, and that was enough for me.
Yeah, you might be right about that, Lynn, about it changing. May have changed even since I took it last year, I think. So
yeah, I think it did. Last year, you
yeah.
only had assignments, right? You didn't even have an exam.
Yeah, he gave us a take home at the end, but it's difficult to give an answer then with all those changes. But I don't know, for harm expectations are strange.
Yeah, I guess it would change from year to year. So I think Lynn and Julian are currently teaching steel structures. No? Well,
It's Lynn and Jacob.
oh, sorry, Lynn and Jacob. What are the key topics that you'd encourage to focus on in steel structures, or do you have any other tips for that subject?
So I think this one has changed a bit since we took the subject, because Tim said that this year he wants to focus more on bending, compression, and tension, whereas in the previous years it was like combined actions and connections that were in the exam. So yeah, focus on bending, tension, and compression.
Yeah, that might have come with the online switch because I only did it last year and it was more compression, bending, tension focused. So
Right.
Well, I agree with that. The notes again helpful, and in your notes I recommend referring to parts of AS4100. Like you could copy out the entire standards in notes, but that's not really a great use of your time. Better to have page numbers and section values and all of that. They're like, this is the formula. If I'm a little bit confused in the exam, let me turn to AS4100 and read more about its context, type of thing. There and being prepared for that. But yeah, Steele's practices. Tim does release practice exams. I think the 2021 will be the most helpful one. And it can be helpful to go through that. But I think for Tim, the conceptual side is always like the most difficult part. I think his calculation questions are usually quite straightforward. I don't think they're any different to anything you would have seen in a tutorial. But the conceptual stuff is something that will probably be new to you. And so you need to think about how you want to think about questions.
And with those conceptual questions, now that Tim has the online videos, the first one he usually does for each subject is the high level concepts video. So would probably be useful to go back over them and just watch that one and make sure you understand everything that he goes through in those.
Yeah, I would recommend, if you can, print the standards and bookmark it, highlight stuff, and also annotate it with those high level concepts, so you know like what each of these random symbols mean, represents, and so on. And that just helps you overall for like the entire exam.
Yeah, I would agree. Making up your own notation is sometimes helpful, which is a bit weird, I know. But you're like, what AS4100 has. And if that's completely different to how you're thinking about things, it's worthwhile to like translate it into your own symbols and something that's easier for you to calculate.
Yeah, so I think it's like 6 o'clock, so we might move on to breakout rooms. So how this is going to be structured is that Lynn, Julian, and Jacob will each have their own breakout room. And in these breakout rooms, you can choose which breakout room you join and ask any questions you have for them. If you have like a specific unit in mind, you can ask about that unit. So I'll open up the breakout rooms. And you should be able to see at the bottom that you can choose what breakout room that you go to.
All right, well, see you guys then.